A good host is the difference to make or break your podcast. Your host is always there. If they're not that strong, I don't care how good your guests are. People are eventually going to say, I could probably find that guest on another program. I can't sit through listening to this host.
If your company is thinking of starting a podcast, you might know you'll be in crowded territory. So how can your podcast stand out from the crowd? In our next episode of Everything Thought Leadership, I talk with Scott Smith, a business podcasting expert who's helped IT research giant Gartner produce its popular ThinkCast podcast. In our interview, Scott and I discussed his 26 years at Gartner, where he began as a writer for its audio news magazine, and how he moved up to host the Gartner ThinkCast podcast for 3 years. The keys to producing a great business podcast, including defining the audience, having an overarching strategy for the podcast, and determining who is going to be the host. That's a tricky one. And thirdly, what's next in Scott's career, given that he just left Gartner? He'll explain where he wants to bring his podcasting expertise to bear. Hey, Scott, great to have you here. I invited you to talk about podcasting, both video and audio podcasting for B2B audiences, because you've had a great career at Gartner doing that. And I was also interested to have you on the show because you, like me, were a journalist at the first part of your career and you were a sports writer. And I decided good sports writers were a dime a dozen and I was only good and I needed to do something else. So I went into business journalism. But anyway, great to have you here.
Thank you.
And let's start by talking about your career in journalism. Right after you graduated from college in 87, you went from George Washington University and then you began working at newspapers?
I did. And first of all, thank you for the opportunity here, Bob. I'm very excited to be here talking with you. I started my career at the Claremont Eagle-Times on the Vermont-New Hampshire border, Claremont, New Hampshire. The irony, and this will become ironic once you hear why I got hired at Gartner, was they held the job open for me for about 6 weeks, not because I was some great budding journalist, but because they were just going from, this is the late 80s, from typewriters to computers. And we had a very experimental computer system for newspapers at the GW Hatchet. That was the name of the school paper. So experimental and so effective, it never made it to the mainstream. But because of that experience, they said, we'll hold the job for you. In all honesty, the only reason I even applied to the classified ad in the Boston Globe, which my father had mailed to me, was to get my father off my back, thinking I'm going to spend my first couple months just hanging out. Didn't work out that way. It was the greatest thing I could have done working in this small town in New Hampshire. I learned so much by doing it. But again, because of that supposed technical expertise, I got hired. The job was a chance to be thrust right into it, learning to talk with people. I had been working for my town paper back in high school. Again, the school paper at GW, but just by doing. I'm a big believer in you get out there and do it. Journalism, as you know, you can only learn so much in a classroom. Everything you learn goes out the window in the first time you meet somebody who doesn't want to answer your questions, the first time you meet somebody who might be reluctant because it's a difficult subject. You learn your people skills by doing that. After a couple years in New Hampshire, I thought it was time to move back into Connecticut. I got a job as the sports editor of a weekly newspaper. I did that for about a year and a half in Darien, Connecticut. Back in my old stomping grounds, they had been a rival of us in high school. Then I moved from there, though, from writing to the editing side of things. I joined the sports desk of the Greenwich Times. Proud to say we were named one of the top 10 small newspaper sports sections by the Associated Press when I was there. Proud of that. And then moved into the news side of things and eventually working my way up through the news desks and the city desk of both Greenwich and the Stamford Advocate, our sister paper, a bigger paper. I always put papers in baseball analogies. If Greenwich was an A-ball team, Stamford Advocate was a double-A team. But yeah, I was starting to see the writing on the wall that I was not going to hit the majors like the New York Times or something like that.
And so then you decided on a career change. So how did you, Gartner is based in Stamford, Connecticut. I imagine you knew them before you applied to them because they were At the time in 98, they were a less than billion dollar. They were not a tiny firm. They were a little less than $1 billion in revenue. And so I imagine you'd heard of them. But this is completely different than journalism, right?
Yes. So a few things were working there. One, newspapers were starting to their long slide. The death knell wasn't there for them, but you could feel the jobs were getting harder to come by, at least good ones. The other thing was I had gotten kind of typecast with that kind of double-handed pat on the back of, you're too good, we don't want to lose you doing the night shift. So I could never get myself over the day. My wife and I were looking to start a family, and she basically said, I don't want to have a life where I'm handing the kid to you as I walk in the door from my day shift and you're going out on the night shift. Started looking around, and a former colleague of mine from the Stanford Advocate was working at Gartner and said, you may want to work for this company. Now, here's where the irony comes in. I told you I got hired because of my IT prowess at my first newspaper job. With Gartner, this is 1998. It's a key point. It's the quaint days. I think people forget now how technology was not ubiquitous in the business world. And they were launching a new audio magazine called Talking Business, aimed to explain technology to business people. And I'm not talking about how to use the cloud or cybersecurity. I'm talking about what is the internet and how can it help my business? My computer is more than a typewriter. Here's how to maximize it. Quaint now, but this is what the atmosphere was. And they wanted somebody who would not be afraid to go in front of all of these world-renowned Gartner experts who knew their stuff backward and forward and say, I don't get it. Explain it to me again. No, it still doesn't make sense. Explain it one more time. So essentially, I got hired there because I didn't know technology. Complete 180 of where I started at. But again, it was willing to be, and this is a key thing when we start talking about being a good podcast host, for instance, it's something about willing to not be afraid to not know what you're talking about. So it's okay to say, I don't understand. You're the expert. Tell me. And I got hired as a writer and producer, learned my way, the difference between print and audio, a big difference in learning those scripts. And then that started my journey through Gartner, which by the time I was done, I was doing things that didn't even exist when I joined that company after 26 and a half years, which, by the way, shows my math prowess. It was a 3-year plan to stay at Gartner. And I stayed, about 8+ times that amount.
Must have been a good run. I mean, Gartner had grown when you joined it in 98 from less than $1 billion to, I think it's $6 billion in revenue today. And so it's a much bigger firm and a much more international firm. So just thinking about when you joined them and having written for CIOs myself, starting in 1985 at Information Week and then afterwards, was it a challenge to get the Gartner analysts who had used to been talking to IT executives? More or less, you're saying, we need to dumb this down for a business executive. We need to explain this in language that the average business executive understands, because they won't understand the acronyms and the IT lingo otherwise. Was that a challenge to get the Gartner analysts to, quote unquote, dumb it down?
Yeah, it was a challenge. And a large part of it is, this might come as a shock to your audience. I say that sarcastically. Gartner loves its acronyms, for instance. Everything seems to need an acronym to get out into the Gartner lexicon. Well, a lot of people don't know what that acronym is on first place, even somebody very in that industry, into that sector. Or there were so many acronyms that could mean 3 different things depending on which sector you're talking to. You had to remind people, slow down. Can you explain that to me quickly? Or wait a minute, what makes this different, X different than Y? And it was hard because they were used to being in a room with like-minded people. And at this point, the IT industry was branching out where, no, your buying center was no longer going to be your CIO necessarily. It was going to be your head of sales. It was going to be your HR director. They don't know the technical side. You've got to tell them why this will change what they're doing. It is not as easy a shift as it might seem. And more importantly, it was brand new for people who were used to being in a strict technical world back then.
Interesting, because I think a lot of employers back then would have said, the people that you're working with to get on the podcast, the Gartner might have said, Scott doesn't get this stuff. We need to find somebody who gets this IT stuff. right?
Right. Right.
So obviously you were there many years and they decided not to get rid of you because you don't get this IT stuff.
Right.
Well, what did you do to win the confidence of the analysts that no, the way Scott is looking at this, we got to dumb this down, folks. You got to explain it to me, and then I'm your filter here for CEOs, other business executives. How did you get them to trust you?
A few factors. One of them was I mentioned I got hired for a program called Talking Business. That lasted about 3 years and then got merged into a program that had been more longstanding, Talking Technology, which was at that point the flagship audio news magazine in the IT industry. The great thing there was it allowed me to be writing for both audiences. So I got to build up behind the scenes a bit more of a flow and how to reach that audience. Just as important was more the societal factors. That very thing I was hired for exponentially changed. It was like a rocket ship going up of the way business and IT quickly started coming together. As a result, that audience I got hired to write for started merging more and more with that CIO IT leader audience of Talking Technology to the point where they needed to write for both audiences at the same time. Just think of it like giving a presentation, and one day it's everybody is an IT leader, and the other room is everybody is in business. Now they knock the wall down. It's, okay, I've got to reach both of them at the same time, and I can't do it like, you don't want to look like Woody Allen in Bananas where he's translating English to English. That's what you don't want to look like that with, okay, IT folks, here's what it means. Now, business people, this is what we mean. And couldn't do that. So I got a chance to grow with the industry. And even if I stumbled at times, and I look back and say, ooh, what was I thinking in writing that script? Or how did I put that through? But it was because we were all learning our way through at that time. And I also think it was that willingness, as I said earlier, to be able to raise my hand and say, I don't get it. I'm not following. People trusted me because they knew I wasn't trying to sell myself as the expert. My job is to set up the Gartner experts to explain Gartner's expertise. I never got up there and said, hi, I'm the expert on how to use the internet to improve your B2B efforts. I'd be lying to them. But they knew that, and they knew that, hey, I don't know the answer to this question. Let's go to somebody who does. That is a big thing, especially when you're hosting a program. You don't want to come across as, everything about everything.
So it sounds like that's critical is, well, who's going to be the expert? Is it the host or the moderator, or is it the host's guest? Let's get clear on who the experts are going to be.
I learned that actually, you asked about that first job I had as a sports writer, and there I am, a 22-year-old kid, and I remember being on a football field in Windsor, Vermont. The football coach had been this long-standing expert. Defense was his key thing. And I thought, I got to go make sure he knows I know football too. And as I'm trying to ask a question about defense, his eyes just had that look of, what are you talking about, kid? And I realized right in the moment, right, he's the expert. I'm not. Why don't I just get to the question of, can you explain how that defense is going to stop that team's top-ranked offense? That awareness, that asking the question of, no one's tuned in to watch me. Now, there are hosts who are there because they know their expertise. If you're talking thought leadership, you certainly can chime in and say, hey, I've run into this with my clients. I've helped coach them on this. Nothing wrong with that. But that's not my expertise. If I'm interviewing you, I can't sit there and say, if I were running the company, Bob, this is what you should be doing. People are looking going, what are you doing? That's just ask him the question, please.
So do you see that mistake being made often in podcast land, in video and audio podcast land, where the host is trying to act as the expert and the host really isn't the expert?
Yeah, I think it's twofold. I think one, it's that when they're really not the expert and they're trying to sound like it. And what happens is they take the airtime away from the actual expert, the guest, who on that day, most likely people have tuned in to see that guest versus, they're appearing on the program. I better catch this episode. The flip side can be too, even if you are the expert, if you've got somebody on your program and you wind up doing more of the talking than they do, all the people take away from your program is, wow, you didn't give that person a chance to get a word in edgewise. And now they're perceiving you as somebody who's not going to listen to them. Right or wrong, that's the danger. So even when you are the expert, you've got to tamp down your expertise, use it to set up the person who is appearing for you to give their expertise. And you can chime in and there's ways to do it, but the key thing is always remembering the guest is there on limited time. Give them a chance to talk. You're there every week, every day, whatever the cadence is. And you can tell, though, when it's somebody who's an expert and just doesn't know when to pull the reins back versus it starts to become very obvious to the audience of, wow, you know more about this than I do. What are you trying to say?
So let's talk about the Gartner Studio 56, which led to the ThinkCast, which led to a revamp of the ThinkCast. Give us a little bit of, the evolution of that and your career and your learning journey.
The media programs for several years were kind of the redheaded stepchild at Gartner simply because we didn't quite fit into what were the marketing efforts at the time. We certainly weren't a research arm developing something new. So we kept moving around. Finally, as video was starting to emerge in the early 2000s as a really powerful tool across the business world, they decided we'd be better off developing an in-house studio, and our programs got moved under that. We also would do custom audio programs for clients who wanted Gartner expertise to appear alongside theirs, etc. And those were some great programs as well to get to do. In the course of that, I remember I decided, we needed another segment. I'll record the voiceover to the segment. My first time as a voiceover did not go well. People asked who the junior high school kid was they had allowed on to do the recording. I had to learn how to modulate my voice. I had to learn how to carry myself. Luckily, they said, Scott, why don't we work with you and then we'll let you do it again. I bring that story up because a few years later, after a couple hosts had changed hands on Talking Technology, I stepped in to become the host and carried that over for nearly a decade doing that. That's the thing you'd asked about being at Gartner for 26 years. I say I worked at the company, but I didn't do the same job. They allowed me to grow. They allowed me to evolve. And that was a big thing. Nobody at Gartner ever said, that's totally new. You can't do that. You had to prove it. You had to show it would work, but you did have the chance to experiment. So I helped with the video. There's something about walking past a bunch of audio bays, video editing bays, and hearing your voice coming out of each one because I'd been the main voiceover guy. You get very self-conscious about your voice, like, ooh, made a mistake there. Can I go back and record? And my colleagues got sick of hearing me because they're like, we don't have time for you to record, Scott, again. It's good, trust me. But as my own worst critic. But from there, I was able to grow, do more and more, build up my reputation across the company, which when the time came for podcasts, set me up well for that.
The history of podcasting, in my view, is fascinating and is now a key piece of the thought leadership marketing mix. According to a website called International Podcast Day, at the turn of the 21st century, people carried around Apple iPods, listening devices that they could put in their pockets, and that's when blogging also began to take root. The technology tools existed for journalists and others to make audio recordings and to put them on their websites, which made them available for others to download. That enabled the pundits of that time, the thought leaders, to voice their opinions directly to their audience. In 2004, a columnist for the Guardian newspaper in the UK named Ben Hammersley wrote an article about podcasting. He is credited by some with coining the term. That article helped podcasting catch on. By the end of that decade, a new breed of companies, podcast service providers, were squarely in business, and famous people like George Bush, Steve Jobs, and Ricky Gervais jumped in as podcasters. Now fast forward to 2024, and podcasting had caught on in a big way. In fact, it was cited as one reason why American voters chose Donald Trump over Kamala Harris. Trump was more podcast friendly, appearing on many more podcasts than Harris did. Now, as the thought leadership marketing tool, I view podcasts as essential for many B2B companies, and for two main reasons. The first is it makes some of a firm's best thinking available to clients in their downtimes, while they're jogging or walking or on a plane and so on. The second reason is podcasting humanizes a B2B firm. It makes it seem like a personable bunch of people that might otherwise be assumed after you read dozens of white papers authored by a bunch of dispassionate brainiacs. In fact, the study that we led in 2022 of more than 150 companies that use thought leadership to market their expertise found that out of 9 thought leadership promotional tactics, podcasts trailed only videos as the most effective ones. Podcasts were rated as more effective than webinars, blog posts, white papers, and other articles, and conferences, among other tactics. So let's talk about the podcast. And did that begin as both a video and audio podcast or just an audio podcast?
No, that was strictly an audio podcast. Podcasts had been out there for a few years growing in the business world. Gartner had not really embraced it yet. In fairness, it was hit or miss of the way companies had embraced it. It felt more of an edgier thing. Gartner is, by reputation, very staid, very high respected. We finally, myself and a couple of people from the marketing department said, no, you really want to be out there and getting your voice out there. This is a key way. You're going to lose a valuable marketing channel if you don't. So they said, go ahead, try it. Show us how it works. And we were able to get some great interviews on the idea we would be promoting Gartner research or conference or something like that by having a newsmaker or a thought leader from that to talk. So the video was completely separate. We were doing video programs, but we were not looking to run it. At that point, podcast was audio, video was something completely different. But we got to grow the program and experiment and try different things. So it was a fun time. It was a little bit of the Wild West. It was a little bit of, let's see what sticks to the wall. We weren't going crazy. Don't get me wrong. You still have to fit the Gartner voice. But it was a great time to be trying new things and taking audio in a different direction for the company.
Okay, so you left this fall, and when you look back on, the best podcasts that you did versus the maybe not so best that you did, what do you think are the key elements of success? What is the difference between a great podcast and it's okay, but it's not going to floor anybody?
The first thing I would say is something you would not even see on the podcast or hear on the podcast. That is the strategy behind it. You need to know what you are trying to achieve and who you're trying to achieve it for. Who is that audience? If you're just going out there with a voice that doesn't feel like it fits anything and it just feels like, hey, let's put on a show, people start to say, why are you doing this? What's the purpose? So you want to have that going in. That will inform what you want to do, how you play around with formatting and all. There's a lot you want to evolve. You want to try different things, as I said, but it starts with what am I trying to do? And that becomes your North Star. You're always staying in line with that, and everything else is mixed and matched as you go through. The next one is, and this is going to sound very self-serving because this is what I'm trying to do and help people with their being host, but I really mean this. A good host is the difference to make or break your podcast. Your host is always there. If they're not that strong, I don't care how good your guests are. People are eventually going to say, I could probably find that guest on another program. I can't sit through listening to this host. A lot of times, though, people say, well, how do I determine who the host is? There are ways to figure that out. I'm a big believer in that most people can be very good hosts. There are just some who are not. And there are some who just need more work to learn how to be a proper host. So they will make or break it because they're voice or face of your program, and they will help set up your guest to succeed or fail, or at least the perception of whether that guest is succeeding or failing. And you never want to have a high-powered guest say, I'm never appearing on that program again. Talked over me. They didn't seem to listen to what I was answering and then ask me the exact same thing afterward. There are things that where they're just so robotic. How many times you watch a program, you're thinking, throw your script away, just ask the question, just relax. And too many people don't want to do that. They'll be like, let me see. Thank you. Oh, you just said you know who killed JFK, really? I want to now ask you about something completely different. No, go back, ask a follow-up question. Those are a key thing. And then the third thing, and it kind of reflects back to what I was talking about on strategy, but finding a unique voice that you are not just in the marketplace against your business rivals with a podcast or a video program. You are up against the hundreds of thousands of podcasts that people can take to listen to during their day. The entertainment, the politics, the sports. They're wanting to give you X amount of time. What makes you different? So you want to find a voice that fits your organization, that doesn't feel like, wow, wait a minute, they were supposed to be very businesslike. Why does it sound like they're a bunch of good old boys hanging out and trying to talk sports in their den? You want to make sure it fits, but you also want to be comfortable enough to try something a little different. Hey, we want to show a little bit of a lighter side. Not talking to suddenly go off and do a song and a dance program or anything, but is it more relaxed? Is it meant to be? Everyone says, for instance, the phrase that's all the rage now is the fireside chat. There's usually no fire. They're usually people in suits talking back and forth. It's not relaxed, which is what a fireside chat is supposed to be. It's just become a euphemism for a one-on-one conversation. But you want to find, if you really want to go that angle, how do you get everybody to relax so it is more conversational? Feels like someone's pulling something different out. What makes you stand out so they want to keep coming back to your program versus, all right, I heard it there, now I'm going to move on to company Y and company Z.
So that sounds like it's very tempting for some podcasters to look at McAfee on ESPN and say, we need something like that. He's in his short sleeves and he's got his buddies there and they chime in. We need to do that for our business podcast. We need to loosen it up. So what I hear you saying in part is, that might be entertaining. McAfee may be entertaining, but you shouldn't just say, "Oh yeah, we're gonna do a McAfee type podcast now."
I'm going to give you a perfect example of that. If it doesn't fit your personality, don't do it because it comes across as fake. We both started as sports writers. We both love sports. We both know the terminology. And you know sports fans, they can be the most critical of all of, what are you trying to say? And I would watch bosses get up there and you knew that you could tell their script writer had given them a sports analogy, especially when it was time for the World Cup or the Olympics. The Olympics are going on right now in Paris. Let me do insert sports analogy. And you went, you sound like Felix Unger trying to talk to Oscar Madison. You don't know what you're talking about. It wasn't their fault. Someone thought they were being clever, but it didn't fit them. And instead of it coming across as, oh, what a good way to draw me in, it was, oh, don't do that. It's the same thing. It's okay to try something different. Say, hey, I want to be a little more relaxed. And, oh, that's funny. Tell me, what is the most amusing story you've come across? But if you can't do it, don't try to become something you're not. When I say find that unique voice, it doesn't mean, well, everyone else is doing business interviews, I'm going to start doing a Pat McAfee style program. It's more of, what do I feel most comfortable with? How do we develop that into something that people hear and say, they're the place I need to go to find my advice, to find the top newsmakers, whatever it is. And it's different for everybody. Every host has a different style. You need to find your style. It could be as simple as the script writing. One of the things I learned coming out of print as I started to write for the spoken word was how different that is. Most importantly, when you're writing for somebody else, as I was in those early days, you've got to be careful of what words you put in. Maybe they don't pronounce them well. Maybe it doesn't sound like them. For me, the word that trips me up if I'm trying to say it repeatedly is particularly. It doesn't roll off my tongue. I change it to especially. I had a boss in the early days who just couldn't get words like myth or fifth out. And we had a list of 7 myths to know about. I can't remember what it was. It was like leadership or something. Well, we tried for several recordings. 5th myth kept sounding like Swiss myth. And we're like, we're not talking about hot cocoa here, folks. So we just learned how to change things to the number 5 one is, or at 5, let's talk about X. Little things like that go a long way, and it all adds up to personality. If the person sounds like it's not them, you lose your authenticity, you lose your stature to interview, and it can really change the course of your program.
So if a client said to you, look, Scott, we want, the CEO, he or she is going to do the podcast. He won't or she won't let anybody else do it. It has to be that person.
Right.
And you interview that person and that person is pretty stiff and the voice is unemotive and just you're thinking, nah, I don't know about this. Is there somebody else? But the client is saying, sorry, this is who you're going to work with. Nobody else is allowed to be the the host.
Right.
How do you work with that person? What would you do?
Few things on that front. First would just be to sit down, let them do their thing, and then to start gently critiquing and practicing through. A lot of it is just reps. A lot of it is going through and saying, let's try something different here on the practice side before you even get for that microphone and interviewing somebody else. Finding what is their voice. Are they stiff because they're the type of person who feels they have to be overly prepared and they're staring at a script the whole time and afraid to go off script? There's ways to loosen them up. As we used to do these custom interviews at Gartner, as I mentioned, with other companies. I had a CEO on one time, and the microphone and the camera are very unforgiving audiences, and many will freeze up and then tell you, I don't get it. I'm used to speaking in front of 10,000 people. Right. But that lens, that microphone, they're not laughing back at your joke. They're not nodding and going, wow, great point. You're just left to flounder and say, I hope they like what I'm saying. He was so nervous to the point where I said, okay, hold on. Let's just pause a moment and relax. It's okay. Why don't we start with an easy thing? I'm bumped into you in an elevator. I love what your company's doing. Can you give me 30 seconds on why your company is outstanding? This is the CEO. And his reaction was, can I call my marketing team? He literally said that. I'm like, okay, we're doomed. How do we get around this? So we had to figure out another way. It might be the questions. It might be just the tone. You have to identify what is their tone, what relaxes them, and then work with them. Again, by not doing it in the moment live, you can say, it's just you and me. Let's try this. Let's try to be more conversational. Okay, you're right. It failed. Nobody else ever saw that. Nobody else ever will. It's confidential. You have to have that room to do that as well. And really, it's asking that company up front, is it because it is the person you're insisting on because they run the company and you're afraid to say no to the boss? I get that. There's no way around that. If the boss wants to do it, can't say no. There's a lot of these programs are vanity plays that there's sometimes no way around it. The other factor, though, is they might think, well, everybody wants to hear from our CEO. And I say to them, we would get that question a lot. Who should talk for us? And I would say, who is your best storyteller? Can convey your message the best? Because unless it's that top name, Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, go down the list of people who you would have on say, I want to hear who that person has to say. After that, 5 minutes in, this person can't seem to get two words together, or this person seems stiff. They don't care about that title or name anymore. You need to have this compelling, engaging story. So that's figuring out who is the right one. But then there are many steps, practicing, figuring out those steps to work with them and get them to be better. Just give them confidence. That's really what it is confidence.
So kind of in my world of thought leadership, I know a lot of people in companies. Sometimes they run the company. Sometimes they run a service line of the company, whether it's a law firm or a consulting firm or an accounting firm or an architecture firm, where that person is considered a thought leader in his or her field. And so that person has a lot of personal brand power. And so a lot of clients and other potential clients might listen to a podcast that person presides over simply because they like his or her ideas and his or her writings and books and all that. So if that person insists or the company says, no, this person has the most brand value in the marketplace, we really want him or her to be the host of our first podcast, you see how that person would act live, and that person needs a lot of work. Would you still tell the company, your client, look, I understand the brand value of this person, but it's going to take some time and some work to develop that person into a really good host? Is that what you would do?
Yeah, you have to be honest with them. But at the same time, you have to ask them, what is your goal by having this person in that role? And what I mean is, if you're asking because you just want their presence there as the interviewer, maybe that's not the best spot for them at the time. You can work with them to get up there. But if you're saying, no, we want to make sure people know their expertise and they are the equal to the guest, I would say, let's then do a panel. Let them be the expert there and have somebody else do the moderating so they look more comfortable. That also works better because one of the things that happens when you put that expert in as the host, they feel the need to explain and say, oh, that's my field of expertise. Let me tell you a story. We would have that happen from time to time with a panel, and the analyst would say to us at Gartner, I would like to moderate the panel. And they were experts. And they were very engaging, very personable, but they would jump in and wind up giving their own answers, then pivot back to the question. You know what the audience would leave is ratings and comments afterward? Why didn't the host let the other panelists speak? They saw them in the moderator role, not as a co-expert. But if you put them on the panel, I would say to them, let them be an expert. You want to get them out there. I'm not saying keep them off the air. In fact, we can work with them. They're just not ready right now. Let's not put them in a bad light. Let's not put the company in a bad light. Let's get something out of it, and then they can transition into that role. So that's why the person may not be that. It's what is that role? A moderator or an interviewer is not necessarily the same as your best expert.
So that seems to me to be critical for a professional services firm or other B2B firm that said, we have a podcast, video and audio. We got to figure out who should get this role, the moderator role, the host role, and who should get the guest role, whether it's a panel of guests or just one guest.
Yeah.
We got to figure out who's going to play these different roles because they're very different roles, and certain thought leaders may not be great hosts.
Right. That is exactly right. Everyone thinks that, oh, look, I've got a microphone. I know how to ask some questions. I'd be an excellent host. Then when you get into that flow, it changes dramatically because, again, you need to remember you're setting up your guest to give those answers. And it doesn't mean you can't exchange stories, but there's also an art form to doing that. You're able to be the host because the very nature of your business is, Bob, to listen to them, capture their voice, and then help them put their voice out there in the marketplace. That allows you to take that into that hosting and listen back and forth and say, hey, I did this in this role. How have you experienced it? If you're been the head of sales and you're used to being the one who walks in that room and dominating the conversation, you may be more apt to say, well, I didn't work for me. Why would you go into a room and do that? Well, you may think you're provoking them, but you're going to come across as the bully on the air. There's the optics of an interview are just as important of what's being said because the audience will take away what they perceive as the personality, the expertise, or just, wow, that company put somebody who seemed very rude out onto the program. Do I really want to do business? Are they going to listen to me when I call up? You have to factor all of that into account.
Yeah, that's part of what I call, doing the chemistry fit. So you read somebody's book or their Harvard Business Review article, you see them do an interview, lead an interview, or be interviewed by somebody, and you say to yourself, boy, is that person arrogant? I don't think we'd ever want that person in my company. They've just disqualified themselves.
Exactly. Or you listen to it and you're like, oh, we got to do that. And then you realize that's not the personality of our company. We're demanding everybody make a gigantic shift to whatever direction you're heading, and it just falls flat. I'd even go back to a good example would be like GE, which tried to completely pivot to a digital phase and then realized, no, at heart, we're a manufacturing company. We better pivot back to that as our core. It's a learning curve, but in an interview, though, sometimes you only get so many bites at the apple. People can be forgiving at times and say, I'll give them a second chance. They like your guest coming up. But after a while, I just can't listen to this. I can find that guest on another program. I just can't listen to one more interview with this person leading the charge.
Okay, so let's talk about your new company and what's next up for Scott Smith.
Next up is my new venture is called Penbury, Penbury Consulting. And really it's to take this expertise I've learned over more than 40 years as an interviewer, but particularly from those 26 and a half years of the media world at Gartner, and help both individuals, companies, and organizations to go out and develop the best media program possible. What is the best way to get their message out there? It could be also helping their people to become those best hosts that they can be. So they have staying power, and that helps them stay above the crowd, but also they develop and continue to grow as hosts. That's my goal for people. Because as I say, I believe people can be outstanding hosts. They just know those little tricks of the trade and practice and just get better at it. I was listening, you asked about going back of all the different interviews I did. Those early interviews, they were cringeworthy to me. What was I thinking when I did this? And I got the chance to grow. I listened to it. I improved on it. I tried something different. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. But I just kept interviewing. And that's one of the keys. But I also had people think, try this, try that. And listening is one of the best things. It's the obvious. If you're a good host, listening is your best skill.
And obviously, Gartner has invested more resources in podcasting over the years. Gartner must have said, this is something we need to continue to do. It helps get our name out there. It maybe even generates business by somebody who sends a link to a podcast we did to somebody who's not a Gartner subscriber, et cetera, right? I mean, Gartner has, I imagine, has continued to see value in doing this.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, what happened, the reason I moved off of Gartner ThinkCast after starting it, and I was host for over 3 years, was the next thing that came along were the webinars and the video. And since I had the video experience, I was asked to step in as a moderator. But we didn't fold ThinkCast, quite the opposite. And in fact, beyond ThinkCast, which is considered the Gartner-wide program, individual research teams now have their own podcast to go out there and dive deeper into their area. So they've expanded the use, and there's a bit of a Gartner family of podcasts out there now that it's very, it's expanding its reach. And like you say, the programs are morphing into taking different looks, whether it's audio, strictly audio and video, maybe there's a video program. There's more, and it spans across rather than it being contained and saying, no, this is the only program you're allowed to do. So it's they're seeing that value. And in a large company like that, that's hitting different constituencies, it's a very valuable tool to have out there.
I really think that's a good signpost for how, B2B podcasting, video, audio, and company webinars, et cetera, are the way the world is going, which is companies that sell expertise, whether it's a law firm or a research firm or a McKinsey or a PwC accounting firm, accounting and consulting firm, just delivering expertise through prose, through 2,000-word white papers is not enough. They need to get their people out there where their ideas can be heard and seen and presented through video and audio.
There's another strength to something like a podcast or an interview format like this one as well, and that is by having the guest and not just your own people up there, and not just a presentation of what makes us a strong business, is the audience sees themselves in that guest. Oh, they've got that thought leader on because of X, and I'm dealing with that same issue. But that thought leader wants to work with them. I need to learn more about the company. It's a chance for them to see themselves. They're on because they wrestled with this transitional issue in an industry. Wow, how does a company, I'll give you an example, easier to give the example than trying to explain that out, was one of the people we had on the podcast, ThinkCast, was Mark Randolph, who had been the co-founder of Netflix, and he talked about innovating and so forth. It was a chance to say, this is a true innovator, and he works with a company like Gartner to learn what's out there next, where Gartner is learning from people like that and then passing their expertise along to you, not just those Gartner analysts. That message, which wasn't hammered home, but rather was suggested, is a very powerful tool. So those were the other advantage of having a program like this. It gives you a chance of success by association.
Yeah, look at the company you keep, that kind of thing.
Bingo. Very important. Very important. And a chance to spotlight it in a way that doesn't sound self-promotional. One of the things that I hate hearing in any program is that hard sell, where it's, hi, guest, tell us why you're here. It's because our company is great, isn't it? No, ask them what is the issue they're dealing with. Have them tell you, and I wouldn't have been able to solve it without working with company X. That is the most powerful tool, that soft sell comes across, because people are like, oh, wow, I'm here because of the issue I'm facing. I'll have to turn there to find a solution rather than, great, I tuned into an infomercial. You're going to now tell me the next great mop that's out there. I don't need it.
Absolutely. Well, Scott, it's been great talking about your career and where you're going from here and the future, the present and future of business podcasting, audio, video, and other ways of visual and audio communication. I wish you all the best in the next chapter of your book, so to say.
Thank you, Bob. I'm very excited for that next chapter because I really, as you can hear, I'm passionate about it. I think people are really not even tapped into the full strength of podcasts, especially from a business sense. It might sound a little weird with all of them out there, but I really think with some easy coaching and so forth, they can really stand out above the crowd.
Excellent. Okay, Scott, we'll be checking in with you 6 months to a year to see how this new business is going.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Bob. Glad for the opportunity.
If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you left a like and if you shared the episode with your colleagues. Everything Thought Leadership is a video and podcast series from Buday TLP. It's for thought leaders and thought leadership professionals, the people who help experts get recognized as thought leaders. You can find out more about Buday Thought Leadership Partners at budaytlp.com.